Fatality, my diamonds that cold. Versace chunks, I hit my backstroke. Knock on the door, she at the back, bro.
Welcome back to another episode of Houdini is Hip. In the previous part, we looked at Vellum. I introduced you to Vellum, but we only looked at it in a very basic capacity. So let me just clear a few things up in terms of how I intend on proceeding forth with simulations and such. So we started with particle simulations, right? And particles, as we spoke about, are just points that move around and are influenced by forces and colliders and things like that. Then we went ahead and we took those particles and we went towards Vellum. So in a Vellum simulation, those same particles can now have collision with each other. So that allows us to do things like sand or grains, right? And then we looked at what happens if we take those grains that can collide and then we constrain them with primitives, right? And that gave us kind of glue constraints for our grains and our grains clumped together. So next what we're looking at is taking geometry, constraining it, and then actually affecting the geometry with those constraints. It's much the same as what we've already done, where we're just adjusting our points, but now we're looking at things like cloth, soft bodies, and all of those kinds of things. So these are the other types of simulations within Vellum, and Vellum can do a lot. So we're going to continue on with Vellum in a fresh file, straight into Houdini. So let's go ahead. Right over here, we can drop a geonode. We will call this cloth simulation and dive inside. So inside of here, we're going to go ahead and just create a cloth. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to start with a planar patch. Now a planar patch is really just a grid, except what it does is it creates these little triangles. So instead of a grid that's made up of quadrilaterals, this one's made up of these little triangles. When Houdini simulates with Vellum, you actually want triangles. Triangles work a lot better for Vellum simulations. So we're going to go ahead and use this, right? A planar patch. We can move this up. So we're just going to move this up by 1 on the y-axis, and we just have that over there. Then we're going to use a Vellum configure. So in the last part, we used a configure grains. In this one, we're going to use a configure cloth. So go ahead and drop that. And what this will do is it will create a cloth for us. And there's a bunch of settings on here, but the first thing that I'm going to do is create those 3 nulls like we did before. So we have this one over here. I'm just going to duplicate it over. Remember, you can hold Alt plus click and drag, and you can duplicate it just like that. We're going to have one that's going to be geo, another that's going to be constraints, and then the last one over here is just colliders. So then we're going to go ahead and create a Vellum solver. Over here, we're going to plug these 3 into the correct inputs. One thing that I like in terms of layout is to press Shift plus S. What it does is it kind of squares off your connections, and I just find that it looks nicer. It's also nice when you're working with Vellum. I like the way it looks. So Shift S allows you to switch to these kinds of connections as opposed to these. But that's just a personal preference. All right, so we have a Vellum solver, and as we saw in the previous part, if you just play this back, it will fall. But I'm just going to switch on the real-time toggle, as we always do. Play this back. There goes our cloth. So let's go ahead and add a ground plane, and then we can play this back and watch it fall. Okay, so there's a piece of cloth, sort of. There's a couple of things that aren't right about this cloth. It doesn't quite behave like a cloth, and it doesn't look great. So we're going to go over and adjust our constraints. Now, in this situation, right, we have this geo over here, and we can still consider it as points, right? All of these points over here. The difference is we now have geo as well. And that geometry tends to not intersect itself. So if the cloth falls over itself, the geometry won't simply like slide through. And so that's another layer to the kind of point-based collision. So we have that, but then we also have these constraints, right? And these constraints are what you actually see kind of bending and twisting and stretching and all of that. So if we add a null over here after the simulation, if you play this back, you can actually see that those constraints move in the exact same way that the cloth does, because that's what's controlling the movement of our cloth. So what we can do is we can adjust the constraints. And when we do that, we go over here to the Vellum cloth, and you can see over here, we have stretch and we have bend, right? So stretch, again, just refers to each of these primitives that are connecting our points. How much can those primitives move, right? How much can they stretch? So if you have 2 points, how much can the primitive connecting them stretch? And how much resistance does it have to that stretch? And bend, much like stretch, is pretty self-explanatory, right? It's the constraint's resistance to bending. Now, as we saw before, both of these have a default of 1, but they're multiplied by some sort of value. So if you haven't seen this before, this 1e plus 10, that just means 1 followed by 10 zeros. So it's a massive number. If we're looking at something like 1e minus 10, then that's 10 zeros followed by a 1. So 0 point, and then 10 zeros, 1. So that's super low. And then you have everything in between. So these are just like preset multipliers that you can use. They're really nice to have. So we can actually leave our stretch as it is. Generally, stretch is pretty okay to leave as it is for most cloth simulations, because things like cotton and denim and that don't really stretch, and those are the things that you are often going to be simulating. So we often leave that. Bend is quite important. Bend can make this go from something like rubber, if we push this up. So let's push this up to like 1,000. So 1 times 1,000, and it's like this rubbery plane. But then you can turn it to something that's closer to silk if you drop it super low. But if you drop it too low, you'll have some issues, and I'll show you that soon. So as you can see, that's very, very soft. Okay, so then we have these two things, which are called damping ratio. Now, so the damping ratio is how much energy is lost in a step. So let's just say if we have something that's bending, and it's bending very fast, or it's bending a lot, we can actually dampen the amount of bend that's happening, right? So if we dampen our bending over here, so let's just increase this value a bit, you have that. So what it allows is for things to collapse more naturally. They don't jitter like rubber would. So if you want to remove some rubberiness from a simulation, you can increase the damping ratio on your bend constraints. So something like this, again, that looks maybe like some sort of soft cloth. The other thing that you can do is that you can increase the resolution of your cloth, and that allows for kind of finer movement. So if we go to the edge length on our planar patch, we can reduce this to half of this, so 0.05. Much finer simulation. It'll take a bit longer, but it looks nicer. So as you can see, again, we're having that situation where things bounce. So what we can do is, again, we can go over to the actual simulation, the Vellum solver, and increase our substeps to 2. That over there will make this behave more like we would expect it to. All right, so we've got a piece of cloth. This is kind of boring, so let's do something else with it. Let's look at making an object that's not a grid a piece of cloth. So let's go ahead and drop a sphere. So I'm going to drop a sphere over here. And the sphere, we'll just move it up so we can increase its center to 1 on the y-axis. And this over here, you'll notice, is a quadrilateral mesh. So it has triangles and quadrilaterals, but we would like it to have triangles. Now, yes, I know in this situation, you could actually change it to a polygon that gives you triangles. But let's just say, for example's sake, that that didn't exist, right? How would you turn this into a triangle-based mesh? You can use a remesh. So a remesh node right over here. The remesh node, if we plug this in, converts whatever geometry we're putting in into triangles. This is extremely useful when working with Vellum. And you'll notice over here, the target size is actually the same setting that we have over here for edge length. So if we have the edge length over here at like 0.05, we'll have a much finer looking mesh. Now, you'll notice that some triangles are kind of stretched and squashed. What you can do is you can increase the iterations. It will result in a much nicer mesh. And then you can allow for some smoothing, so 0.25 or so. So that just smooths the mesh, and it kind of foregoes some of the fidelity of the mesh, so it might kind of smooth the actual geometry, but it allows for nicer triangles. So again, we can just swap this in instead of the planar patch right over here, and switch to our Vellum solver, and just play this back. So we just have this cloth that's kind of collapsing. Now, in this situation, it looks a little bit weird. And this is where I would want to work with something like stretch, right? Something that can just allow this to stretch a little. So I'm going to decrease the stiffness on our stretch to 1e plus 7, so 1 followed by 7 zeros, and increase the damping ratio by a factor of 10, so 0.01, and then play this back. In my opinion, that looks like a nicer piece of cloth. Okay, cool. So we have this little sphere now falls to the ground. Kind of boring, right? This is where we're going to start looking at soft bodies. So what a soft body is a piece of geometry that tries to maintain its volume. So there's some sort of volume preservation to it, but the actual geometry has some give to it. You could think of something like a stress ball, but that's just one example. You can look at things like jelly, right? Or like a squid, or just a bunch of different things. In fact, Vellum is used for muscle simulation as well. So if you need that sort of rippling effect that you see on muscle, you can do that with Vellum. So we're going to go ahead and look at soft bodies. So the way that you create a soft body, well, actually there's two ways. The first way is with struts. Now, when we're talking about struts, what we technically have is a cloth. So let's just say the sphere is this cloth. Inside of that, you just have a bunch of struts, right, that are kind of connecting up the inside of the sphere to prevent it from collapsing in on itself, right? You can sort of think of it as when you put up a tent and you put up all the little sticks and things and you put the top over. That's what a strut is, right? It's those things that just kind of keep the cloth up. So we can go ahead and use a Vellum soft body, and you'll see that there's two. We have the configure strut and the configure tetrahedral. We're going to start with the strut soft body. And over here, you'll notice that it creates two nodes. It creates a Vellum cloth for you, and it creates a strut. So that's exactly what I just said, right? It first creates cloth for you, then it adds some struts to that cloth to give it some rigidity. So what we can actually do is we don't even need to use that. If we have our cloth over here, we can just add struts ourselves. So if we just add Vellum struts, plug it in after our cloth, just like that, we can see that we have cloth over here, we have struts over here. And if we look at our constraints now, it's a bit difficult to tell what's going on, right? Because we have two sets of constraints. We have struts and we have the cloth constraints. So what we can do is we can actually use a blast node to kind of see the two separately. If we drop a blast node over here, we can plug our constraints into that. And over here, we just say delete something, right? So over here, under the constraint tags, we have Vellum cloth 1 and Vellum struts 1. If we say delete cloth, it'll just leave our struts. And we can also say delete non-selected, and it will only delete our struts, right? So one or the other. So we're just saying delete Vellum cloth. We say delete selected or delete non-selected. So if we say delete selected, then we're just removing the cloth constraints and all we have are these struts. Okay, so these are what struts look like. Just as I mentioned, they're all of these little things that prevent the cloth from collapsing in on itself. Now the Vellum struts, so these constraints, have their own settings for things like stretch. If we take a look over here, you can see that we have stretch of 1 and damping ratio of 0.01, and the stiffness is multiplied by just 10. So it's lower than what the cloth is. And this just allows it to kind of collapse in on itself, right? So if we play this back now, it will look kind of weird, right? So you might think that that doesn't look very realistic at all. So what's happening here is that our struts aren't really bending, but our cloth is. And we can actually see this if we play this back, and then we plug this in over here. You can see here that our actual struts aren't moving that much. We can reduce their resistance to stretch and it'll work a lot better. So over here, reduce this to like 0.01, play this back, and it looks a bit weird, but this is kind of cool. So you can imagine this as some sort of thing that has a bit of internal rigidity, but not as something that's solid. I like to think of this more as a hollow object that just has things preventing it from collapsing. All right, so like maybe a lantern or something. So cool, right? That's the one type of Vellum soft body that you can do. The other type is the Vellum tetrahedral. Right over here at the top of our simulation network, I'm going to go ahead and drop a Vellum soft body tetrahedral. So configure tetrahedral soft body, and this will create two nodes for us. It will create a tet conform, and it will create the Vellum tetrahedral constraint node. A tet conform takes whatever geometry you're feeding it and conforms it to what's necessary for Vellum tetrahedral simulations. Now, the idea behind a tetrahedral simulation is that instead of having these kind of internal struts, so if you have the sphere and there's lines connecting just like that, what you have when you create tetrahedrals is actual entire structures of geometry inside your main geometry. You can't really see it, but it exists, right? So almost an entire mesh going on inside. And what that allows is for really good volume preservation, and I'll show you that now. So if we take the sphere and we plug it into the tet conform right over here, you won't notice anything change, right? Or you might, depending on the geometry, but nothing looks like it's changed. However, if we press W for wireframe, you may be able to notice that there's some extra things going on inside, right? So if we look at our remesh, and then we look at our tet conform, there's some extra connections being made inside. And if you can't see this properly, what we can use is a clip node. So if we take a clip, we can plug the remesh into the clip, I'm just going to switch the axis from the y-axis to the x-axis. You can see that it clips it in half, right? That's all that the clip does. You can just drag it and clip a piece of geometry. So we're clipping it more or less in half. And if we clip the tet conform, you'll see that there's actual geometry inside. So the tet conform creates a mesh inside of our main mesh. And we can actually see this, like, it's pretty cool. The entire thing is now solid geometry. So once we have that, we can put that into a Vellum Tetrahedral constraints node. So this, once again, will do all of those things for us. It will create some stretch constraints, and there's other things like mass. We're not going to worry about that right now. You can see at the top there, it says preserve volume. That's an option that we have. And now we can go ahead and just replace these. I'm just going to click on this and replace the existing ones over here and just make some space. All right, so if we go to our simulation now that we've plugged in the Vellum tetrahedrals, we should have something kind of interesting. So as you can see, that's actually really nice for volume preservation. That's kind of like bouncy and realistic and what you would expect this to behave like as a soft body. So this is the preferred way of doing that kind of soft body simulation where you have volume preservation. It is a little bit slower than your struts. However, you can often get away with struts. There are situations where you can. So you just need to experiment with your actual geometry and see the look that you're going for. But just know that there are two different types. If you're looking at volume preservation, tet conform and a Vellum tetrahedral constraints node will do pretty well for you. We've tried with a sphere, but let's try with some other geometry, right? We haven't actually looked at how we can take this and use this to deform actual geometry. Because what we're doing is we're actually losing touch with our original geometry, right? Say this is our geometry and it's something that we've modeled and it's got textures and all of that. We remesh it and then like tet conform it and all of this stuff. And by the time we're done with it, it's no longer the geometry that we've fed in. So if we want to maintain our original geometry, we need to take the simulation and then post-simulation actually affect our original geometry. So I'm going to show you how to do that now. This is actually a really important concept that you're going to be seeing a lot inside of Houdini, where you take the simulation data and you use it to affect the original data. So I'm going to just drop a rubber toy. Again, we have Flippy over here. So Flippy is just this over here. Move him up a little. So one on the y-axis. Plug into the remesh. This will remesh him. We want more detail than that. So we're going to go ahead and change this over here to 0.025. Then we're going to go to the tet conform, and that might take a second. Then we can go ahead and go all the way down to our Vellum solver and try playing this back. So as you can see, this is much slower. This is a pretty dense geometry, and I might actually reduce the density, but you can see what's happening here, right? This is actually way too dense of a geometry, so we're going to reduce the quality of this, but you can get an idea of what's happening here. So let's just put this to 0.04, and you'll notice that this is smoothing over here. So if that's an issue, you can reduce your smoothing. The smoothing is actually a bit of an issue in this piece of geometry because what it's doing is it's kind of detaching these things from its head. So we can even lower this further, and that will just ensure that our geometry doesn't change too much. Okay, so we have that. And this is what I mean, right? You can see that this is now distorted. These are UVs on it that are looking really bad, and it's just not the actual geometry that we started with, right? We started with this geometry over here, but we need to simulate and then reapply our simulation data to that geometry. So with our Vellum solver over here, we can play this back, and this will just collapse over here. Cool, it's like floppy and weird. So how do we reapply this to our original geometry? There's a couple of ways, actually, and it also depends on what you're working with. So, for example, if you're working with cloth and you don't have a tetrahedral mesh, there's a very different way of doing this. But in this case, we can use a point deform, and a point deform is kind of the go-to for a lot of things, but for cloth, I'll show you another way of doing it. So we're going to use a point deform node. We can plug it in after our Vellum solver. Now, the point deform takes 3 inputs. The first input is the geometry that you want to deform. So that's always going to be your high resolution mesh, right? The second input is the low resolution, what you would call a proxy. And then the third input is that proxy once it's been deformed. So let me just explain the idea of a proxy. This is something you'll come across pretty often. A proxy is a lower resolution version of your original geometry, right? So it's useful for if you're going to be simulating and you want to keep your simulations kind of neat and tidy, or whatever it may be, right? It's a basic version of the actual geometry. It's almost like a placeholder. So if you imagine a fridge, right? You've got a fridge geometry and it's got like the door handles and everything, and then that fridge falls over. It's much easier to simulate just a rectangle falling over or a cube falling over than it is to simulate the entire fridge, right? And so what you can do is you can have that cube fall over, and then you can use that cube's motion because it's a very close estimation of the actual fridge, and you can use that to deform the fridge. And we're going to be doing that in this case, right? So we're going to take, firstly, our original geometry. So that's that first node up there, our test geometry, wire toy, plug it into the first input. Second input, and this is again why this is so useful, is your geo. So you can just grab your geo from over here and plug it into the second input. Then the third input is your geo once it's been deformed. So you can just go ahead and grab that over there, and those are your three inputs, right? The first input is your high resolution geometry. The next input is your geo, and you should always maintain a very similar positioning, right, at the start. So if this over here, your high resolution mesh, is in this position, you should have a very, very, very close estimation over here, right? It should be very similar at this point. Then, once we start deforming this, we plug that deformed mesh into the last input, and what that gives us is our actual mesh deformed, right? So this is that first input, but now it's being deformed. And we can play this back, but I actually want to show you a flipbook render. Flipbooking is extremely useful, especially when you want to save simulations and do different versions of them and do dailies and things. So say you're working in a studio and you need to send off some dailies. What you can do is you can run a flipbook, which just records your viewport, and you can use it for previewing things. So I'm going to go ahead, down at the bottom left, if you right click on this render flipbook option, you can say flipbook with new settings. And over here, we can just change our settings. So this is from the start of our frame range to the end. So I'm just going to change this to start to 96. So it'll do 96 frames. And let's just say start. What it'll do is it'll take a second, but then it'll bring up this extra window over here, right? Mplay. And this is just a preview window. So it's the same thing as if you render out an actual render. It'll bring up mplay as well. But in this situation, we're just using mplay for a preview, for a flipbook. So once this is simulated, let's see what we have. Cool. And then what you can do is you can press up and down to play this back. And so that's our simulation, right? So what we've done is we've taken the original geometry, and you can do this with any geometry you want. You can use your own custom geometry over here. You can bring it in, run it through a Vellum simulation, and then reapply the simulation data to your original geometry. And this is also something that you're going to see with rigid bodies, RBD, right? When you have a building and you're doing kind of building collapses and things like that, what you use are little proxies of the actual geometry, right? They're not the actual geometry because the actual geometry is high resolution. It's got lots of like cracks and things. Low resolution is basically just like little blocks. And then what you do is you replace those blocks with the high resolution geometry. So, okay, we've looked at proxies and how we can use our simulation data to deform our original geometry. Now, what's so cool about Vellum is that it actually works really well with itself. That might sound a bit strange, but what you'll notice in Houdini, and it's been an issue for a long time, it's just really, there's no easy fix for it, but simulations don't behave well with each other. Two-way interaction is a very difficult thing to get right. So let's say that you have a balloon, right? And you want water to hit this balloon. When the water hits the balloon will bend, right? That's what it does. So that's one simulation, and the water is another simulation. But to have them interact back and forth is really tough. Like to have the balloon bend, but then the water bounce off the balloon, that's not an easy thing to do. And so what Vellum allows is for that sort of two-way interaction, because Vellum is pretty encompassing, right? You can do hair, you can do skin, you can do cloth, you can do soft bodies, you can do grains, you can do fluids. All of those things can be done with Vellum. Let's go ahead and look at some of those other simulations and try to integrate them together. So let's go over here and just create a sheet of fluids. Or maybe a sphere. Let's create a sphere. If we want, you can use the sphere from earlier, no big deal. And I'm going to move this up to about 2. So it's a little bit higher than our rubber toy over here. And this sphere, I'm going to convert to fluids. So I'm going to use a Vellum configure fluid. So as you can see, it's really nice, right? That has all of these sort of configuration stuff for you, and you can just feed it into a simulation, into a solver. So right over here, we have this Vellum fluid. and it'll take a second to convert that to these particles. We can reduce the particle size over here to something like 0.05, or even lower, right? So something that looks like a nice resolution simulation. Once we have that, we can go ahead and do the same things that we've done before over here. So I'm actually going to copy these three over, click and drag over all of them, hold Alt, click and drag. That will create three new ones. And over here, we can just plug in our new fluid. So over here, just like that, and we can call this fluid, fluid constraints, and fluid colliders. So that's just nice to know because now we have this one on the side over here, and this is our vellum fluid. And then we have this one on the left, which is our tetrahedrals. So fluid and fluid constraints, fluid colliders. Let's go ahead and plug that into a new vellum solver. So we're going to create a vellum solver over here. 1, 2, and 3. And then we're going to go ahead and add a ground plane. And we're going to let this fall. And they splash, right? So sort of like a fluid. So the thing with vellum fluids that you need to understand is that they're a quick and dirty way of doing like fluid simulations. The correct way to do fluid simulations is actually with a flip solver. But the nice thing about doing it with vellum is that it's extremely fast. That's the first thing. And the other thing is that it can interact with other vellum simulation types. So for small scale simulations and for things where you don't need very accurate fluid dynamics, I would say go ahead and use the vellum solver. But we'll be looking at actual fluid dynamics later on, right? This is not really fluid dynamics, but yeah, this is just an easy way to do fluid dynamics. So if we go over to the advanced tab, like we did before, we had the grain collisions tab over there. We also have the fluids tab. Now, as you can see, it has a viscosity of 0.5 and a surface tension of 0.001. Surface tension is just how much the surface of the fluid resists breaking or pulling apart. So we also have viscosity. And viscosity is pretty important. Viscosity is how thick the fluid is, right? So if we look at something like water, that's basically a viscosity of 0. If we look at something like honey, that's a much higher viscosity, right? And then something in between might be something like fruit juice. So they all have varying viscosity. So we're going to go ahead and play around with viscosity for a bit. Let's push it up to the extreme. So we'll go 100 first. And actually, that's not really that extreme, but you'll see what it does. It's a much thicker fluid. It kind of just collapses in around itself, and so that's not bad, right? Again, we're going to have the issue that we had before where our simulation doesn't really behave well, and that's again something that we can fix with substeps. You'll notice that it's almost like it doesn't register the inside collisions over there because we have a lot of particles all kind of registering at the same time, and it's very easy to fix that with substeps. I'm not going to bother too much with that right now, but if we do this, play it back, and we have this fluid. Right, so it looks a lot better when you increase your substeps. It just behaves more like you would expect it to. So the interesting thing that you can actually do with this is you can mess around with the viscosity and actually feed it in as an attribute. So if I go over to the advanced tab and I just set our viscosity to 1 or the default, which is 0.5, we can actually add something over here like a attribute noise. So go ahead and add an attribute noise onto the actual fluid over here. And over here, if I just press space F in our viewport, it'll focus on our sphere. Over here, we can actually change the viscosity. So if we turn this into a float instead, we can set the attribute to change to be viscosity. And then what we can do is just give it an amplitude of 100. So what that means is it'll range between 0 and 100 based on a noise pattern. And we can visualize that noise pattern. If you see over here, this on the right-hand side of the attribute name, that is a visualizer. If you click on that, it'll toggle visualization on. However, it'll all appear red. If we go down to our visualization over here in the bottom right of our viewport, we can right click on that. And as you can see, it's added a visualizer for viscosity. We can edit it over here. And as you can see, it has a minimum and maximum range. So all we have to do is either say auto, or we can actually give it the value. So it would be between 0 and 100, and that would fix it. We can just set it to auto as well. So if you set it to auto, that works pretty well. So now you can see that blue areas or colder colors are low viscosity and red or warmer colors are high viscosity. So now we can play around with settings such as element size. So reduce that element size. We can enable the ramp remap. So we can use this over here to remap the range. Maybe we want some more areas that are low viscosity and then some areas that are really high viscosity. So now we have a good mix over there. We switch to our vellum solver. We can switch off our visualizer and we can play this back. And you'll have a much more interesting simulation because there's varying viscosity, right? So something that you should often play around with is varying viscosity. It leads to much more interesting simulations. All right, let me just move this back up over here. So I'm moving that attribute noise above this over here because we're going to be referencing this fluid node. So I want to make sure that our viscosity is also being recognized. So we've got these two solvers, right? We have this one on the right and this one on the left, but there's no interaction between them yet. So we have the fluid and we have the tetrahedrals. However, if you want to source something into a simulation, you can do that. If we double click on the Vellum solver node, so I'm going back to our tetrahedrals and double clicking on this one, inside of here you'll notice that it says source. We can use a Vellum source node to source in other Vellum objects, right? So if we do this over here, we have this Vellum source node, plug it into the source over there, and over here we can tell it how we would want it to be emitted and what we want to emit. So firstly, we're going to set up what we want emitted. So we're going to choose the soft path right over here. We're going to go inside of this cloth simulation node. That's probably a bad name. We haven't really just been working with cloth, but it's fine. So for the soft path, we're choosing fluid, right? For the target path, we'll leave that blank. And for the constraint soft path, we'll be choosing our constraints. So our fluid constraints over there. Right. So we can now play this back and it will emit our fluid into this simulation as well. And the two of them will interact. So let's play this back. And what you'll notice is that these two now work together. The fluid interacts with our tetrahedrals and our tetrahedrals interact with the fluid. And so that's pretty cool. You have the sort of two-way interaction where the one influences the other. So what happens if we don't want it to be emitted at frame 1? Right? What we can do over here is we can go to our Vellum source over here and we can change when it's activated. So if you change the activation to $FF and you make that equal to, let's just say, frame 24, then it'll only activate at frame 24. So what this is a little expression. It's an HScript expression. And we'll get into HScript and Vex and Python and all of that a little bit later. But for now, I'm just using small expressions that are easy to explain. So this one is just $FF, which is our frame number. I'm saying when it's equal to 24, then activate. So if we click on this now, you'll see that activation is 0. But if we click on frame 24, and this will obviously want to play back, so we'll just let that do that. When it's sitting at frame 24, the activation switches to 1 because that condition is met. $FF now equals frame 24. So if we go back over here, you can see that it only emits at frame 24. And once it's emitted that one time, it doesn't emit again. So that's how you can emit things, just once into a simulation. So we have our fluid that falls onto Flippy afterwards. So that's pretty cool. Falls onto him just like that. All right, so now we have a new problem. If you switch your display flag to the point deform, you'll notice that, sure, it works, but we no longer have our fluid. So what we can do is once again split these up. So we can use a blast node or we can use a split node. I'll show you the split node because I already showed you the blast node. So if we take this over here into our split node, we can go over here and we can select the one or the other. So over here, we have default source and we have Vellum source 1. Now, default source is the thing that just happens to be in the simulation when the simulation starts. And so in this case, that would be our Flippy, that tetrahedral mesh. Vellum source 1 is the thing that we've brought in afterwards. So we can say split the default source. And now I'm just going to put a null over here to show you these two. This one brings in that Flippy. That one has our fluids, right? So it's now split the two. So we have Flippy on the one side and the fluid on the other. All right, so now that we know that we have these two separated, what we could do is we can use the first input and replace this over here. So our deformed point lattice. So remember, we have our geometry that we want to deform. We have the proxy of that geometry, and then we have the deformed proxy, so our simulation data. Plug that in over there, so that still works. The second output over here is now our fluids. And so I'm just going to put a null over here so I can show you that. Right, those are our fluids. So they're separated from our actual rubber toy. So we can take this and actually make it look like a fluid. This is something that you actually do with flip simulations as well. You can take particles and convert them into a fluid mesh. To do that, we're going to go ahead and use the particle fluid surface. So particle fluid surface right over here. And we can plug our fluid. So we can actually just call this fluid output or something. We can plug that into the first input of this particle fluid surface over here. and we're going to have to change some settings. Firstly, particle separation. Particle separation, the easiest way to think about it is how many particles should this expect, right? So the lower this goes, that means there's lower separation between the particles, which means more particles. So if we reduce this, we're increasing the resolution. So 0.1, we increase this to 0.025. And we already have a pretty nice looking fluid. So we can compare that to the original over there, and we're ending up with this. So as this plays back, it begins to look a lot more like a fluid. There we go. So you can see we have these points, gets converted to a fluid. And then all you have to do is merge those two back together. Or you can put two output nodes, you can add materials to them, you can send them to the stage level, whatever you want, right? I'm just going to merge them so we can see them together over here. And just like that, you have this two-way interaction. And we can add like a color node, make this blue, right? So just imagine it's like water or something. And then you can play this back in your viewport. So once again, you can go over to the flipbook over here and play this back. So I'm just going to cut it short, and you just end up with that, right? So there's some two-way interaction where the fluid interacts with Flippy and Flippy interacts with the fluid. All right, so let's do something a little bit crazy. Let's just kick Flippy, right? Kick him over to the side. So we're going to go ahead and drop a tube. So let's type tube create over here. So we have this tube. I'm just going to take a look at where Flippy is. All right, so he's over there. So let's move our tube over. And let's just use end caps and drop a transform node. This is going to make it easier to just move our tube around. So we have it contained to a single node. Move it over here. And move it up a bit. All right, let's make this thinner. So a scale of 0.5 on the X and Z axes. And make it a little bit longer. So 2 over there. That should be cool. Move this up a little. Move it slightly closer to Flippy. And now we're going to go to frame 1. We're going to keyframe the rotation on this and the translate. We're going to go to frame 24. And we're going to keyframe it again. So holding Alt, we click on both of these. Right? So it's keyframed at the start and it's keyframed at 24. And the reason we're keyframing it twice, I'll explain shortly. But then we're going to go ahead and at frame 30, we're just going to flick this. Right? So we're just going to turn it. So flick that up and move it forward and up. Then we're going to hold Alt, click over there, click over there. So if we play this back, it now does that sort of flick over there, right? This over here, where we're adding a keyframe, which is exactly the same as the first frame, is just to prevent our frame 30 from slowly happening from frame 1. So what I mean by that is if we delete this frame 24 keyframe over here, there's nothing to act as like an anchor. So from frame 1, it will already start moving to the frame 30 location. But if we have that over there to act as an anchor, where things should stay the same, then it'll keep this motion short and choppy. Cool. So I'm going to go ahead and plug this into the third input of our tetrahedral over here. So remember, we've got this tetrahedral mesh over here. Let's just go through it quickly, because this is getting a bit messy over here, but it's fine. Like, I'll explain it all. So we have this geometry, we're remeshing it, tet conforming it, and then putting it into a Vellum tetrahedral constraints. We're splitting it up into its geo, its constraints, and its colliders, and we're also bringing that tube in to its collider input. So we have geo, we have constraints, we have colliders. We're feeding that into the Vellum solver, but the Vellum solver doesn't just have this, it also has these things that we're bringing in from the side over here. So it has this source over here. It has the fluid, and it has the constraints of the fluid that we're bringing in from over here and over here, right? These two over here. So we can go ahead and play this back again and see what's happening now. It's a pretty cool simulation. He's getting punched in the face, and you just have this, where it's getting hit and the fluid falls over. So I hope you can see how this can be a lot of fun. Like, you can play around with these things, you can mix them up in all sorts of ways. You can add cloth to this, you can add grains to this, and they'll all interact with each other, right? That's the really cool thing about this. They will all interact as you'd expect. And all you have to do is just use Vellum sources over here. You can just input as many things as you want using Vellum sources, and they'll all just come in and you can add extra things to this. Once again, you split this over here, and you have the fluid coming out over here, right? So that's the one. It gets meshed to a particle fluid mesh. You You merge that together. You have that over there. And if you want, you can bring in the collider as well. So bring that down from up there, right? And now you have the whole thing. Just like that. Boom. So I hope you do decide to play around with this. What I do have is a little thing that I'm going to be attaching, a set of files. You can find it in the pinned comment. What it is a bunch of live action files. So it's got some footage, it's got a piece of geometry. So we took the geometry from the footage and we photo scanned it so that you have an accurate representation as a 3D model. It's got cameras and lights and everything. And what you can do is just throw in some Vellum, right? So go ahead, throw in some Vellum into that scene, render it out, and try your hand at compositing it. So everything's set up for you. So give that a try, see how it goes. If it looks good, if you're happy with it, go ahead, tag me on Instagram. That's 9_between. And I'd love to see what you guys come up with. If there's anything cool, we'll feature it. We'll show it in the next video. But yeah, I hope you decide to mess around with those files. It'll be really cool. You can play with some grains, you can use some fluids, whatever you want. We have our own thing that we did with cloth. I'll show it to you now. And so yeah, you can replicate this if you want, or you can do your own thing. But that's it for this part, right? I hope to see you next time. I hope you did have fun with this. This is really cool. Vellum is honestly one of my favorite solvers, just because of how fast it is and how much fun you can have with it. So yeah, that's all for this part. I'll see you next time. Bye.